Daljit Nagra was born and raised in West London, then Sheffield. He currently lives in Harrow with his wife and daughters. Daljit teaches at Brunel University, creative writing. His first collection, Look, We Have Coming to Dover, won the Forward Prize for Best First Collection, the South Bank Show Arts Council Decibel Award, and was nominated for the Costa Poetry Award, the Guardian's First Book Award, and the Aldenberg First Collection Prize. I also know that you have won several other awards that I didn't write down, and my sincere apologies. I trust that the team will edit it so that it actually sounds correct. Having said that, thank you so much for your time and for making time for us. I promise we'll get you out of here under the hour still, because all of those mistakes were ours. So I'm just going to jump in. One, I absolutely loved your book. It was such a delight to read. I've been running, I think I ran like 11 or 12 panels while I've been here. And I can't say that I didn't like all the books, but I didn't like all the books as much as I liked others. And yours jumped out at me because he had just the best title of any poetry collection I've ever read or I've ever seen. And it also has a great cover as well. And I translate a lot of poetry, and I will frequently translate it judging by title alone, because a good title, I think, is harder to write than the book itself very frequently.
Oh, wow.
And I say this as someone who has never written the book titles myself. Like, my editors always come up with book titles because I just kind of flounder in that. I do think that is very, very difficult. I've also listened to a lot of the interviews that you've given about this book, and what's really struck me is the way that you sort of engage with play. So I was wondering if we could start with that question. What is the role in your mind of play in serious work?
Yeah. Oh, so firstly, which book were you referring to?
We talked about, well, I'm wondering, what book do you think I'm referring to when I say the absolutely best title?
So this one or this one?
Well, they both have good titles. I think Tipu Sultan's incredible White Man Eating Tiger Toy Machine is the most fun I've ever had saying a full title. And I read your other books as well, but I think that I'll be honest, I read your last two books and this one, and I think play is pretty constant in all of them.
Yeah.
But it seemed, the way that you talked about it, that play was part of the inherent conceit of this one, as opposed to the others, that play is part of the performance and the craft of it. But maybe I'm wrong, and if I'm wrong, please correct me. I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think play is central, I think, to everything I do with poetry, mainly because one is the English language is so malleable. It's gone abroad and it's brought words back. And one of the few truly democratic things about Britain is its language. It welcomes words from everywhere. Whilst it resists humans, it welcomes languages. You never hear people complain about a Spanish word that might be used, or, like restaurant Indian language, restaurant words like aloo for potato. I think most people know that word in Britain. Saag for spinach, but people, you'll never hear people say, oh, how dare you say aloo? That's a foreign word. So it's really peculiar, actually, peculiar aspects of British culture where people are really welcoming of linguistic variety. People seem to enjoy the mental play, the wit that language offers. So I kind of embrace it at that level. But also another level, I guess, I feel I was born to an Indian background. I was born in London, and I would have learned English when I went to school from about the age of 5 or 6. My mum couldn't speak any. My mum is completely illiterate, so she doesn't speak any English, or very little English now. And my dad spoke a little bit. So I don't see myself as being entirely inside the English language. So I want to bring in a kind of sensibility that represents my kind of, first language as well. So for me, it's about taking language out of the dictionary, from the Oxford English Dictionary, as much as I can, to remind the reader, I am not your standard Oxford English Dictionary voice, nor do I want to be.
And that fact that the Oxford English Dictionary voice, they are in the vast minority. I'm Colombian. This is my second language, and I just had dinner with the delegation, the University of Chicago delegation for the festival. And one of the things that one of my colleagues said, he visited Jadavpur University uh, yesterday, today. They all blurred together, honestly. Um, but one of the things that were really interesting is that he was running a workshop with the students, and it immediately turned into translation. There is no writing in India without a conversation about translation, without a conversation of maternal tongues and minority translation, specifically minority language. And what was really, really fascinating is that when my colleague John Wilkinson brought up this, somebody corrected him. He was like, "Oh, no, 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 no. I want to remind you that English is an Indian language." And I thought, I understand that completely. And not as it as an Indian language, but it's a global language. And subsequently, and I think very aptly in our conversation, after we had a brief discussion on like English is an Indian language, there is no literature with that translation. We immediately started talking about bad words. What bad words do you know in what language, and what translate and what does not translate? And for me, it is so much easier to swear in English than it is to swear in Spanish. It hurts. I'm like, my sensibilities are kind of offended. I'm like, I can't believe that I said that. It tastes bad in my mouth. But that's what happens when the language is kind of secondhand, and not just
Mm,
secondhand, but belongs to sort of like the hierarchical powers. There's nothing better than like sort of taking it down.
mm,
So when in your book, but also in some of the interviews, you've mentioned, what I really found fascinating was the operative word when you talked about this book was a pouncing. The tiger was pouncing, and I wanted to pounce with my poems upon white authors like Rudyard Kipling and all of these other traditions. And I thought, more than pounce, I think this book devours that poetry. But pouncing is playful, and it makes sense that you would
mm.
use that. So I was hoping perhaps that you would revisit some of that, like notion that
Yeah. Well,
pouncing.
just yeah, I guess maybe just to add to that, 'cause you made some really interesting observations, I think, about language that really interest me. Uh, and I guess you've hit the nail on the head. English is an anglophone language now, and I know when I was writing my version of the Ramayana, because it exists in different forms in different countries, puppet show and all that sort of stuff. I was trying to really consciously bring in sort of Australian English into it, American English, Indian English, just so the language felt as decentered from the centre, from the metropolitan, from London as much as possible. And yet it felt like English, but not English in the way that English people in Britain would speak it. So I was trying to working really hard on really relying on the resources of the English language. It's quite a remarkable language, isn't it? As you mentioned, there's English is an Indian language. It's an American language, and so on. And for us as poets, I think you either shut the borders down and say, I'm going to write in standard English, I'm going to go back to the OED, or you open up and try and find a new idiom that suits your sensibility. And when you start doing that, the world is so free, doesn't it? And suddenly those sort of English authors who write in that kind of standard English voice do sound dated. But
Yes.
unfortunately, those people, they're in their own little bubble, and they give each other prizes, they give each other the accolades. And that's so
Yeah.
as well, I think, because there's a need to preserve something historic. And I find sometimes, sort of white authors in Britain, it almost feels they're still they go up to 1955 or 1958 before
Yeah.
multiculturalism starts seeping in to Britishness. And because you don't see these foreign voices in their work, you don't see the foreign characters in their work. So that's quite interesting, isn't it? So I think what I have to do is just do my own play and have a good time.
I'm so glad that you brought that up specifically, and I have found this. I found that surprising, but at first, but now incredibly reassuring that you have your own version of the Ramayana. And I think just in this festival alone, I've read 4 different versions of the Mukhabarata, right? And it's such a tradition to like revisit like these texts and rewrite them in your own language. And I think almost more than anything else that like this festival has opened my eyes to. Again, I am a Colombian who only translates poetry, so I started like at a distance and have only like broaden my horizons, and I fear that I am the primary audience for this festival. Ultimately, I have gained far more than anything anyone else will. But I think that this is a remarkable thing. There is this constant conversation, and the same people who keep to the 1950s lingo and give each other prizes, and are the same people who bemoan, oh, people don't read poetry anymore. Oh, these, like no one's picking it up. Poetry is being forgotten. Where, like also the same people who will teach Dante, right? The great poet Dante, like what an influence. Literature that wouldn't exist without Dante. The Italian language wouldn't exist without Dante. But Dante precisely wrote in Latin, in the Italian language, not in Latin. He wrote in
Mm.
the vulgar language that everyone would be able to access, and peasants were reading Dante. But now we have kept Dante in a little box, and the notion of Dante, of writing in an accessible manner, the same way that I think a lot of English quote unquote classics are kept in the little glass boxes and taught in universities, as
Mm.
opposed to the Indian classics like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata that
Yes.
don't get put in glass boxes. They get sort of crashed and thrown and reinvented and reimagined.
Yeah.
And Kartika Nair wrote Mahabharata,
Yeah.
and she wrote it
Fantastic.
from the
Yeah.
point of view, that phenomenal book, and from the point of view of a
Yeah.
dog, right? A
That's
dirty
great.
animal, an unholy animal.
Mm.
So when I arrived at your Ramayana, I felt like I had this understanding, but also I have always loved the vulgar quality of true poetry, accessible
Mm.
poetry, and literature. And it seemed to me that that was a line running through your work,
Mm.
relishing that accessibility, maybe turning your back, if I could say that, to those glass boxes and those poets that speak to themselves
Mm.
and about each other, one another.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and, going back to your vulgar argument, I think that's really important to me. I really liked Les Murray when I first got into poetry. His
Mm,
colloquial English, trying to find the kind of the voice of a kind of ordinary Australian, or like Joseph Brodsky. I remember reading an essay once. Joseph Brodsky was talking about W.H. Auden and saying he ladles from every puddle, as though languages were different puddles, and he's taking a bit from each puddle. I love that idea. You're right. In that sense, it's vulgar, isn't it? The best work has to have a kind of vulgarity, because it has to be fresh, doesn't it? It has to sound interesting and innovative. So that
mhm,
should happen. You should be pouncing and trying to reinvent and try and find ways to do things. And it's always better to fail than to be safe, I think. So I don't mind if
yes.
some of my poems fail or a book doesn't quite work, as long as I've tried to kind of keep the conversation going by trying to push those sort of edges a bit. So
Yeah.
yeah, in that sense, there's a type of vulgarity is a positive thing, not
Oh,
crude.
absolutely. I hope it didn't come off as
No,
anything
no, no.
but.
No, just to make sure for the reader, we're not talking about being crude necessarily, but
No.
vulgar is this splashing together of different languages side by side, high-low registers, using kind of formal diction alongside informal, whatever it is, using words from other languages, the kind of macaronic style.
Yes.
Seems the way ahead to me anyway. Because when you go on the internet, on Google or whatever, what language are you hearing? Whose English are you hearing? And whose English are you communicating with? And we are taking on board different Englishes, aren't we? When we have
Mhm.
communication with other people. So it's in
Well,
us, isn't it? Sitting in there, different Englishes.
yeah, I vulgar in the terms of the Vulgate, but I'm glad that you bring that up, because one of the things that really struck me was um, the mimicry of speech that is present in your work. And I was hoping that, I know that we've already touched on it, but why recreate? Because it's one thing to like take the vocabulary that's used in everyday English, to both bring down into the corporeal form elevated forms of literature and elevate the everyday speech. But it's another to replicate dialogue and the way that everyday like people will interact. And also, I think the incredible boldness to open a book with that specific like poem, with a piece that is in dialogue with the author, with the writer, and with the reader and
Mm.
itself.
Yeah, I quite like sort of. There's two strands for me that are really important. One is sort of the mimicking the natural voice, but also the invention of voice. So what I found in my first book was I was writing about my own background, which is largely uneducated rural Indians from North India, from Punjab, who can't read or write and don't speak much English, if at all. So I couldn't really communicate their voices on the page. So what I thought, oh, this liberates me. I'll fictionalize voices. I'll, make up sounds that they might speak. Almost imagining if they spoke English, sophisticated English, how would they sound? How would they sound if they spoke English because of the way they speak now. So in a sense, I was writing from a space of silence because I don't know how, say, my parents or my uncle or auntie would speak English. I wouldn't hear them speaking, so I invented a kind of English for them. So there's that kind of thing as well, isn't there, where you can just really have free play, rather than be burdened by the need to almost be a tape recorder where you hear someone and write it into a poem. So those two strands, that appeals to me, these kind of inventing a voice. And again, it allows you to have more Western reader to think, oh, what is this voice? What original voice? Who is this? Well, they're not going to hang out with us, these kind of uneducated Indians, and my relatives aren't going to necessarily hang out with those educated English people. So there's this kind of false creation of a voice that mediates between the two of them.
So I have a long list of questions here, and I have the next question running in my head. But what you said was so fascinating that it completely threw me, and I was like, I had to look down and look at my notes of what is the next question? Because the notion that we start off we have, in whatever spectrum, and I think this is really fascinating. This is the thing really threw me. If you have the Oxford English Dictionary over here, and then you have the Vulgate, the accessible language, you would think, okay, you're running and you're mediating between these two, but instead of mediating, you've invented another language to really encapsulate it. That's genius. That's just so brilliant. Because that's instead of translating the languages, you've translated the effect, which is that instead of translating the creation of another language and the language it being created, you have translated the creation itself, the effect that it takes place when you have all these languages in your head.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good way. That's probably the right way to put it. It's the effect, isn't it? So, like my very first book, the first poem is of a drunk Indian man coming home after work from a factory. He works in a factory. Clearly, of English. Those people who came over in sort of 50s, 60s, 70s, they often were in their own communities in the factory workplace, so they'll be speaking their own language. So there was no room or time to learn English. So how would they speak, and how do you translate that into an English? So I could really patronise that voice by using lots of monosyllables and make them say rude English words and make them sound really crude. That fits a stereotype of a factory worker, but I didn't feel that way about them. I think actually those sort of people are quite sophisticated, and but whilst they use ordinary English, they probably use it in a heightened moment. We all use language in quite an inspired way, and I was trying to at quite a heightened moment, and so I was trying to create that kind of hyper English. So those sort of ideas are really important to me. And anyway, I thought the English readers would not be interested, and I wasn't even going to book. I tried a small publisher, and he said, "This I think this book would have a bigger audience, and I can offer it because for reviews. So try it elsewhere." And I had a mentor at the time. I won this prize for a mentor, and he said, "Why don't you try Faber and work out?" And Faber were kind of interested, and then reviewed on television and stuff, which actually shows that there's an appetite for something different, isn't there? Even if it's about it's amazing, isn't it? In that sense.
I mean, I think so. I in translation, we have a couple of terms that we use pretty frequently called foreignization and domestication. So
Mm,
when you are translating a text, you can take, and this is an oversimplification of a lot of translation theory, but you
yeah,
can take the foreignizing route or you can take the domesticated route. So if I'm translating from I don't know, Russian and they say drug, then oh friend, or in Colombian Spanish parce, and I say like oh hey pal, right? Like that's the domesticated route. Or I can let you learn the word parce. And every time that they meet each other, they say, oh, parce, what's up? And then you slowly go like, okay, that's the thing.
yeah.
Now, what's really interesting here, I think, and I'll just say this like one last thing and let you answer this question, and then we'll move on. Again, I apologize. I'm fascinated by language and the way that you've
That's
like done the
great.
replication of
Thank you.
speech. But so when I was getting my MFA in translation, I was kind of really obsessed with this Heideggerian notion of the world expanding. And Heidegger is very complicated. He was a Nazi, so I'll say that aside for a second. But he has this like really beautiful notion in one of his essays. He says the stone has no world, the animal is poor in world, man is rich in world. Essentially saying that the world is not as big as the world is. The world is as big as you have the ability to understand the world, which means that your understanding can get bigger and the world therefore can get bigger and bigger. And I loved that. I loved that so much. I thought there is no loss with more languages. My world is so much bigger because I learned English. It got bigger when I learned Italian. It got bigger when I started learning other languages, and it can only get bigger and bigger. But my mentor and professor then sort of like took a pause and said, but there is a loss, which is the use. Oftentimes when you select the language that you want to learn, you like the sound of it. People like the way that French sounds. French speakers can't hear it, right? I can't hear the sound of Spanish because they are words to me. There's only sound when you don't have the understanding of it. And that is true foreignization. You push something aside and then you can extricate all of the superstitions and prejudices that come with something. So when there is, an attachment to only blue collar workers or only working class people speak like this, you have this entire baggage. But if people were able to hear it without understanding it, like French, they might be able to hear the poetry and the beauty of the way that rhyming slang works without like the prejudice and the like cultural baggage. And I think that's the way that I was able to experience what you were writing, instead of all of the other books that I've been reading with all the footnotes. This is what this means. It's referencing the Veda, it's referencing the caste
Well,
system,
thank
and
you.
then it has to be fully intellectualized rather than allowing it to sing in a foreignized way.
Mm. Well, thank you for that. It's really acute observations, actually. Thank you. I'll probably just add to that. One of the things I would say when those sort of create those characters, and the thing you talk about then is if you catch those characters sort of sat there reflecting calmly and quietly, you may catch them in a very plain English, and that's very much the English mode. But if I want to catch them at their best, at their most heightened use of English, I need to catch them in an excited state. So it felt really important to me, like my first book and the Tipu Sultan book, when I have those dramatic monologues, to catch people agitated or excited, um, and wanting to convey something that felt kind of Apollonian, I guess, or just sort of full of fire. Not Apollo, the other one. But sort of, yeah, I guess just full of fire, full of excitement, and then you can capture that language, and we hear the range these people potentially have, and they might be from ordinary education, but you're not necessarily hearing them in their original language, but you're hearing them in this artificial language that I'm creating.
Yes.
But hopefully it's doing honour to them rather than usual the middle class the kind of, we say middle class here, of patronising the working classes. And I come from a working class background, and it's important to me to ennoble those people, to show them with their vigour and variety of languages.
Yeah. Yeah. I think very frequently mimicry of speech of particular groups of people, especially, the quote unquote that haven't had access to as much education, feels condescending. And there wasn't an ounce of that here. And I think it's because of the methodology that is clear. I always tell my students that it takes an enormous amount of effort to make something look effortless. And I think these poems specifically feel to me like the epitome of that. They do look effortless. They really flow, and the language feels incredibly accessible, but there's so much scaffolding obviously behind it. So I was maybe hoping that you would be able to talk a little bit about craft. What are the rules that you create for yourself? Like, what is the methodology and the approach that you take to these sort of poems?
Yeah, I think the key thing underneath the diction, patterns of diction, what excites me is how you make a word sit next to another word that might be from different traditions, like slang to formal, or throw a Punjabi word in that sits alongside a formal English word. That finding patterns, almost embroidering English. So it's not the regular speech of the tribe. That feels really important to me. So constantly there's a shift away. Obviously not overdoing it, because if you overdo it, then just reader turns off because it's exhausting or it's difficult. But finding an accessible way to embroider language so it feels like it's expansive and it's taking its different traditions of speaking and bringing them together in this unified text. And wherever possible, I mean, not every poem, I'm really excited in having energy and pace in the poem, using, for example, even triple rhythms. So ideally where there's two non-stresses, wherever possible, rather than the iambic voice. I quite like in my head, and I know this is not true, but there's that kind of the pacier couple of non-beats in a line. It almost feels like the poem's oscillating in my head between east and west, between me being Indian, me being British, between me feeling like I'm living in England, living outside of England in a kind of wider range of spaces. So hopefully underneath it, the language, the rhythms are feeling rather more. And also, I would say, if you think of the three categories, just to finish here, if you think a lyric poem, narrative poem, and dramatic poem, I would say I'm much more happier being a dramatic poet, where you create a character and they enact something, or they've got a dilemma and they need to resolve it. They might do something by the end of the poem. So it's not a narrative, is it, where you have a plot, like a longer sort of narrative poem, but much more a dramatic poem. So quite often I will write monologues and dramatic monologues. My next book, which is coming out later in the year with Faber, is called Indium, Indiom, but there's a bunch of characters sat together and they're talking about Babu English and Coolie English. Okay, so I imagine it's a poetry workshop and they're thinking about Nissim Ezekiel's Babu English poem. He wrote a few Babu English poems. And so they're going to, the characters, and so they're not a narrative, but a dramatic poem, it's a book-length poem, where they're thinking about ideas of what is Babu English, this eccentric English that's spoken in India, and how can it be a force for good. So I'm very interested in creating characters. That's what I enjoy. But I'm not interested in writing a novel. I'm not necessarily interested in writing a big narrative poem. I did that with Ramayana, but that gave me the narrative, thankfully.
And I thought that you were able to sort of write counter narratives within the your version of the Ramayana, and I really appreciated it, in particular because the Ramayana really contradicts itself a lot, plot-wise. Like things happen consecutively, but it's also really interested in discussing, well, war primarily, obviously, but sort of like principles and culture and society. But that was very much not the focus. So it felt very much far more interested in the human aspect of it rather than like that big plot and didacticism of that enormous epic.
Yeah,
Is
and
that
I
fair?
guess I spent a couple of years researching on the Thai, the Ramayana from Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines, Burma, Nepal, any versions I get hold of, thinking about puppet show and graphic novel traditions of it, to really pull my language apart as much as I could, so that hopefully the reader feels this Ramayana is the most bastardized Ramayana imaginable. It's pulling on every different tradition of the Ramayana, to just give you this kind of hybrid 21st century version of the story. The Ramayanas tend to be quite pure. People write one based on their little region, and they can be very serious. But I mean, to me, the spirit of Ramayana, or the Mahabharata, is just higher energy, and especially Ramayana, a lot of fun, a lot of silliness, and lot of, obviously the big dialogues and the big set pieces, but there's a lot of fun within that. Whereas as opposed to, the Greek epics, when you get the translations version of them, very serious, very dour, and that's because it does suit that. But the Ramayana, it is far more eclectic, and that's why it exists in street performance so much, because it lends itself to so much fun. So I was really trying to capture the spirit of Ramayanas through the language.
I think we should have sillier versions of the Iliad. I think that this is a big argument for the Iliad in sock puppets. I think we would all benefit more from bringing down like that big, overbearing Greek notion of it's a beautiful literature, but it also, a lot of mythologies have suffered in the shadow of Greek myths because they've been over translated into the OED glass box version. And sillier, more interpretive. I think Mary Jo Bang did a really great translation of Dante's Inferno, for example, that had that bit of play in it, that was sort of phenomenal and fascinating. Now, I am very aware of time, and I know that you have to go, so I just have 2 questions left for you. In one of the interviews, you said, and we're going to have very young audience for this talk. So you gave advice for young writers, and you said, write all the time, and send your work out, share it, and get, I quote, armadillo skin, to be able to like absorb that criticism and take it in stride. Do you have any advice for our probably very young audience? And I take this moment to like thank our digital audience, which without whom this could not.
Well, the most important thing is fun. If you find that you're not enjoying the piece that you're writing, abandon it. And poetry nowadays, I would say, is really can touch at the very fringes of the art form, in the sense that you can bring in images into poem. You can write social media poetry. You can, you put drawings in or a bit of maths in. I'm really excited by the idea of poetry going in all directions. And when I teach at university, or when I do workshops with, say, students around the country, around the world, I really try and encourage them to really use the various languages in their head, whether it be visual drawing language or written words, to really have good fun. Don't feel you have to write a nature poem that's a lyric poem. Really expand and enjoy yourself. And usually I find when first year students at university come in really nervous about writing poetry, but once you liberate them, often I set the first activity in the first 2-hour session is, you have to write a piece that doesn't look anything like a poem, a conventional poem. And it sort of really blows their minds, and it really sets them off on the journey of experimenting, because they can always go back to the conventional stuff.
Of course.
And actually some kids will like that, but a lot of children won't like that at all. They want to have fun,
But it's also, I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Please go on.
No.
It's so frustrating. Like, for example, the running a workshop, and the notion that we are teaching writing is something that I've always resented, because I can't teach that. The only thing that I can teach someone to write is to write like me, and that is stupid and terrible for many reasons. Number one, I don't need the competition. I'm already having enough trouble placing some pieces out there on my own. But two, what use would there be, right? Like, if we just continue sort of replicating rather than, I think, instead of teaching, craft can be taught, but I think we're finding writing. But by doing that, going like, what is the language in your head, rather than learn these words, learn this language, this is what poetry looks like. I think my greatest accomplishment as a professor so far was in a group, in a project, and I'm like, you can write a paper, you can give a presentation, you can do whatever you want, but bring me a new Frankenstein, because I was teaching Shelley, and they made it into a cake, and it was the most beautiful cake I've ever seen. It was also delicious, but far more importantly, it evoked so many ideas. Rather, it represented those ideas in a way that I had never experienced before. I've read Frankenstein so many times. I've never tasted Frankenstein before.
I'm glad to hear it was tasty.
It was delicious. It was, I'd never anticipated that a corpse would be delicious. but that's the thing. It didn't exist in the world before, and now it does. And even if that was a failure, it was a failure at something that no one else was, as opposed to an essay saying, Mary Shelley and fathers and mothers and whatever.
Yeah.
So I believe that you have to go now. Is that correct?
Yeah. Thank you very much. That was brilliant.
Okay.
Really good to hear
I
you. And I have to read some of your
Thank you
work
so much.
soon as well. So I look forward to reading
You
your
don't
work
have to,
soon. Oh, I
but
look forward
it's
to
been
it.
a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you so much for making the time. I won't keep you any longer. I hope
Thank
you
you
have
very
a
much, Lina.
fantastic day.
All the
Have a
best.
good
Thank
one.
you. Bye.
Bye.